The strapless sweetheart bodice is a style that's seen on a lot of formal garments. Its name comes from the heart-shaped curve at the top of the bodice. I'll be using an existing pattern for my example and using a lining. Most sweetheart bodices are going to be made up of princess seams, so this means that you should have at least a center front, side front, and back pieces. I'm cutting out my bodice pattern pieces from my main fabric and from the lining fabric. To stabilize my fabric, I'm going to cut my interfacing from my pattern pieces and attach it to my main fabric pieces only. First, I'll take my center front piece of my main fabric and stay stitch the sides of it from the top to about 3/4 of the way down. A stay stitch is to keep the piece from getting misshapen during the construction process. You just sew a regular length straight stitch on your seam line, so I'm doing 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, but you're not sewing any pieces together at this point. Next, I cut slits into the seam allowance of the center front in the stay stitch part only. You can cut all the way to the stay stitch, but don't cut your stitches. By cutting these slits, it'll make it easier to pin the side front pieces to each side of the center front. Sew these seams at your sewing machine using your standard seam allowance. Don't forget to backstitch. Then I'll pin the back bodice pieces to each side of this and sew these seams as well. You'll just repeat the process with your lining pieces. Press all your seams open when you finish. Because this bodice is strapless, it's usually a good idea to utilize boning. You can use metal boning, but plastic boning is usually easier to find at most fabric stores. Plastic boning comes in a casing. You'll want to cut the boning and casing the length of each seam you have. So for my bodice, I'll be cutting 4 of them. You don't want any boning where you'll be stitching, so on each end, push out the boning and cut off whatever your seam allowance is, plus a little extra. For example, my seam allowance is 5/8 of an inch, so I'll trim off 3/4 of an inch instead. After trimming, round off the edges. Remove the boning from the casing, placing them under heavy books to flatten them out. Pin the casing on the wrong side of the bodice lining in the center of each seam. Stitch down the length of each side as close to the casing edge as possible with a regular straight stitch. Then slip the boning into the casing and baste across the ends. Our lining will be used to finish the top edge of the bodice. Pin the bodice and lining right sides together all along the top edge and stitch. At the very center of the bodice V, cut a notch in the seam allowance to your stitches, but make sure not to cut the stitches. Also, cut your seam allowance down to 1/4 of an inch to cut down on the bulk. Pull the lining away from the bodice and understitch. This means that you sew on the lining side next to the seam line, looking at the right side of the lining, and all of the seam allowance should be closed and under the lining exactly where you are stitching. It may be hard to do the curve section, so go as far as you can. Now turn the lining back over to the wrong side of the bodice and press. At this point, our bodice is complete. The bottom edge is still raw because it'll be attached to a skirt, and after that the zipper will go in, finishing the raw edges on the back. The sweetheart bodice is a simple design, but one that always looks classy and elegant. We hope you enjoyed this tutorial. Please subscribe to get notified of our weekly releases. Also check out ProfessorPincushion.com to view our complete library with well over 350 sewing tutorials. If you would like to directly support us, you can check out our Patreon campaign and earn some exclusive perks. Thanks for watching.